So, guys, appreciate you taking the time to come on the show today. For people who don't know, maybe if you could just give a quick introduction to who you guys are and what it is you do.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm Alix.
I'm Keir.
And together we're Switchblade Cinema, but we make films under the name. We're a directing team primarily, and we go by AK. So we made a movie called Kill Your Lover, which you can kind of see over Keir's shoulder, called Kill Your Lover. And that was our debut feature film. So it's an AK film, if you will. And then our production company is Switchblade Cinema.
The idea, we were just talking before we started recording, and like you guys are primarily based in London. Is that I guess a personal decision or like a career choice to be based in London? Because I feel like obviously with what you do, it always seems like it makes more sense to be in the States.
I mean, we're both kind of weird mutts in the sense that I was actually born in London, and my mother's Scottish, my father's from Texas. I lived the first 10 years of my life in London. And then we moved back to Scotland at some point when I was a teenager. And, you know, I ended up moving to London just because it was kind of like the biggest city. It was where the industry was based here.
Well, and we met in Scotland.
And we met in Scotland.
So that's where we came from originally. I mean, my accent is ridiculous. I'm very like aware of that. I've got lots of touches of Americanisms in there, but I'm actually fully British. I'm just I'm a bit of a mess at this point.
But I think it's like that kind of thing of like, I think the industry is becoming a lot more complex as well. Cause even like, you know, we go to LA a bunch and like, you know, a lot of people just kind of these days are like, you know, there's not necessarily any reason to live in LA anymore. And like the film industry is becoming fractured and split up into different areas. And you're starting to see like more people like, you know, there's the indie world in Austin. There's more stuff that's coming out of the, you know, about Seattle, and also like Atlanta's obviously become like a big hub for making things. Obviously there's always been the New York indie scene. So I think you're just going to start to see a lot more sort of like pockets of these things. And so I think that, I mean, it's interesting because there's a production company we're working with at the moment, and part of their big appeal, our big appeal to them, is that they want to make things in London with, you know, a British filmmaking team. So it's kind of like, so it really does depend. I think
they're US based,
yeah,
just to clarify.
And I think like, so, I mean, I think it's kind of easy to think, oh, well, everybody needs to go out to LA, but I just don't necessarily think it's true anymore. Because we thought about moving to LA like a number of years ago, but kind of like, you know, the reality is just not a lot gets produced in LA in terms of actual production anymore.
And also in terms of like living in London, obviously, I think sometimes people feel the need to move to London. I'm not sure if it's strictly necessary anymore. It just, we're coming up on 10 years here. So like this is just where all our friends are. So it's like, I've thought about like where else would we live basically, and it's very difficult because I think as soon as we moved away we would miss it. So it's just a really difficult balance.
Yeah, it's funny because I've had conversations with, I guess, creatives and filmmakers from all over the world at this point, and I always feel like that when I talk to people outside of the States, there is still a degree, at least when they're kind of, I guess, aspiring to get somewhere, maybe a little bit of a feeling of like, oh, well, we're like outside the box of America or whatever. But then there seems to be this huge fan base and kind of a lot of stuff going on over here on this side of the world. And then the amount of times I talk to people in the States, they're like, oh, I want to go to Europe and like work with a European production company, or I want to go to the UK and work with people in the UK. I don't want to be in the States and do this, which is kind of funny to see that dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always the grass is always greener on the other side kind of thing. I mean, what I will say is like there's so much great stuff going on in Ireland in particular, like especially with the horror scene and everything. I mean, I'm sure you know, but like, you know, we're almost like, oh, they really got it going on over there, which was great.
Well, that was a funny thing. Yeah, we were touring Kill Your Lover around US festivals. And it was funny because we'd be the only British film, but you had like multiple Irish films,
yeah,
you know, going around the festival.
Yeah. I mean, Damien McCarthy, for instance, like who we're friends with, like he's just gone from strength to strength, and I can't wait to see what he does next. Because we saw Oddity, we were playing at the same festival in New Orleans called Overlook Film Festival, and it was just great to catch up with that, and the figure was there and everything as well. So it was just like really good to see him like make that progress in like, you know, just a couple of years time from Caveat.
Well, and also like All You Need Is Death was just following us around festivals
True,
for a bit as
yeah.
well. You know,
Old
it was just
Wayne,
kind of like it's just so. I mean, like that was kind of the funny thing is we were kind of like Ireland's a country of like what, like 5 million people, and
Yeah.
we're just kind of sitting there going like, why are we the only British film here? But there's like multiple Irish films.
Yeah, I was like, we've got it figured out. Something in the water.
Do you think that because I've talked to Paul recently enough, and we had a little bit of a chat afterwards and since, and he kind of felt a little bit like sometimes in the UK, Ireland, and maybe some of the markets they're not seen, even though they technically kind of are, they're not seen as hotspots. That a lot of people maybe get turned off pursuing their idea before they even get a chance to see if they can make it a reality, just because they're like, okay, well, I'm in Ireland, so obviously there's nowhere for me to go with this. I need to be an American. I can't go, so I'll just forget about it.
There's an interesting element to some of this as well, because you know, I speaking of this too, as you know, someone who's, even though I don't sound it, I'm Scottish and lived in Scotland for a number of years, and I think there can always be this kind of false dichotomy. Sometimes, obviously, they shot a lot of like Game of Thrones out in Ireland, and you know, they shot Outlander out in Scotland, and you'll have these big productions coming through, and you know, Glasgow ends up doubling a lot for like, you know, other cities. And so there's these tax incentives and things that are brought in to kind of like boost the, you know, the local economy and get crews working. But I think sometimes there's a fallacy that necessarily creates domestic work as well. So I think it's like that thing sometimes that people will look at it and go like, oh, there's tons of people coming over here to shoot, but you know, whether that's actually manifesting in local stuff. And I think like that's it. Even if you're there, you end up feeling like, well, you know, these big productions that are coming in aren't necessarily for me. I still have to go over there to get people interested in the stuff I'm making. Yeah. So, I mean, and I would say
that's the thread with us for sure. I mean, we've definitely had the most interest from North America. We've sold to Germany as well. So those are kind of like, but that doesn't mean that you can't create stuff that appeals to that crowd, I guess.
Well, I think it's
essentially what we've done. So I guess
it's an interesting one too, because I think like where people have really like engaged with our film is often more from a universal perspective than it being, say, a British film. And I think that has hurt us at times as well, because it's like kind of like people like they think of, say, especially I think it's true for Ireland as well. They think about like, you know, British films or Irish films, and they go like, oh, I want a certain thing. I want to get a certain thing out of that. I don't necessarily want to see something that's universal and could work here. I want to see like folk horror or something that's like got Celtic mythology or runes or things like that. And then it becomes almost disappointing when you've made something modern and kind of like more sort of, you know,
international, melting pot culture.
Yeah, exactly.
Why do you think that is though? Because I'm a little bit fascinated by this, considering that anytime I talk to anybody, it's like, oh, I wish there was more going on in the UK and Ireland and maybe some parts of Europe. And there seems to be a massive fan base over here. And even like when there's like, you know, simple things like conventions, like For the Love of Horror, they come and like they get all these different actors and makeup artists and things, and people pay crazy amounts of money. The lines are like out the door, they sell out everything. So there seems to be a massive fan base. What do you think maybe the fear is with some of these companies to get involved?
I think especially, I mean, it's one of the struggles that, you know, I always had in Scotland, was this kind of thing of going like, you know, there's still that you can have the huge fan base there, but they still don't necessarily equate it to, say, the fan base of North America. They're always going to like, America's always a bigger market. So people are always going to look at what is the thing that's broadly selling in North America. Because that's the thing, is like any sales company we've talked to, that's the first thing they're looking at. They're looking at how is it going to sell in North America? Because that's also true. All the European territories, they're very individual. They're all smaller. They're all kind of like more insular. So not even insular, but kind of like they're smaller populations, they're smaller markets. So immediately they're going, what's the biggest market that we're trying to attract?
Yeah.
And so
but I don't know if that answers your question, but like when it comes to production companies here and like the support for genre films, I would say that in broad speaking terms, like the support has only just really started. I think, you know, some festivals, some funding bodies, shall we say, have only started seeing the viability of genre because North America's kind of been leading the way. And they're like, well, okay, I guess they did have a horror film at Cannes a couple times now. Maybe we should start following suit. But in terms of like actual funding stuff, I do feel like it's still going more in the drama direction, and that's seen as more important, even though really great stories are being constantly told by genre films. It's just that we're in a more heightened space, which I actually think is often more like impactful, to be quite frank. But I think there's been a really great program that's just started, the UK Genre Next Wave program that's just started this year. So there's like a couple things that are like in the works. But ultimately, like, I do think that a lot, at least from what I've heard from other people, as well as based on our own experience, there is definitely a self-starter culture and very much a grassroots indie, do it for peanuts, see how far you get, which of course can be very unsustainable depending on what kind of background you have as well.
Would you say then, I guess, I know you guys probably have ties, a lot of ties to be able to go back and forth between the States and over here, but would you say it makes the skill of being able to pitch a movie or an idea even more important from your point of view?
I think so. And I think also, I do think that there's a lot of advantage that comes from being able to look at a world outside of your own domestic environment, because I think that it's too easy to become like, just get fixated on your local festivals and, you know, local community and go like, well, I'm going to make stuff for them and please them. But ultimately, you know, I mean, I think you need to be looking at the other markets. You need to also be looking to build relationships internationally, because the reality is, especially in the UK, I don't know what the situation is like in Ireland, but in the UK, you're really not going to get any kind of exclusive funding for a feature under, you know, at any kind of like, you know, sort of like, you know, big budget level. You're going to need to look at co-productions. You're going to need to look at international money.
No, I'd agree with that. I think one of the things we've been saying a lot, and depending on how helpful that is, I mean, we made a lot of shorts before we made our feature, and I would say our shorts directly informed our feature in many ways. It's kind of like a Frankenstein's monster of like what we've done before, combined into this sort of body horror, toxic relationship, just kaleidoscopic fracturing of, you know, just insanity. And if you watch the short films that we made before, you can kind of go, oh, I see that element in here somewhere, which is quite interesting. So a lot of stuff is trialed and tested in that sense. But what we've been saying a lot recently is, because the short film space is so oversubscribed now, because everyone, like, you know, it is easier for people to get access to kit in that sense. Like, you're not shooting on film anymore. Is I say to people a lot of the time, like, make 3 short films that you really believe in, and then move into the micro budget feature space as soon as you can, because it's not worth spending, like, I've heard, like, to me, horror stories of people spending like 200 grand on a short film, and I'm just like, oh my God, no, you should. I just feel like you should definitely be making a feature film, because that's just going to benefit you and your collaborators way more if you're going to be able to sell it, and also just get people to take you more seriously, to be honest, because that's definitely the difference we've been feeling since is, I mean, we're in like a great position in the sense that we've sold our movie and we've already made our money back. And so being able to say that in a pitch has already made a huge difference.
When it's one of those interesting things too, where I think people lose sight of the economics and how technology has changed things. So for instance, it used to be, if you were making a short film, that was something you had to like financially invest in, because you still had to like shoot it on film. You still had to go through processing, chemical processes. You still had to like edit on, you know, sort of big clunky equipment that wasn't like just stuff that you could have at home. Whereas now, you know, you can film anything on pretty much on easily accessible cameras and edit it on your home laptop, and you can come out with a pretty decent result out of that. Especially short films. Short films are like, they don't take a lot of risk to make, and I think because of that, it means the market is saturated with them. There are any film festival you see is inundated with so many short films, and it means that the amount of short films means that the ultimate value that they have to the filmmaker is very much diminished. So you need to look at a short film less as something that's going to make you or get you to that next point in your career, as much as it's a learning process. It's an excuse for you to go to festivals, to meet people, to like gather more information and to sort of learn your own voice, learn your own key, and sort of have some trial and error. But the reality is that probably what a short film could have done for you in, say, like the 80s or 90s is now what you kind of need a micro budget feature in order to do, because that's the thing where people are going to take you more seriously if you've made a micro budget feature as opposed to a short film. The reality is people will say, oh, you finished something. That's it. Like, it's almost like with a feature, just even the reality of finishing a feature, because people know how difficult that is, that gives you more cachet than any short does.
Yeah, it's funny because I don't know if this is like correct or not, but I think I seen something online that Danny Boyle had shot that new 28 months later movie or whatever with iPhone 15s and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that I always think is a little bit innocuous, because it's kind of like, how much of it did he shoot? What were the lens attachments that were being used? It's not like he just went out there with his phone and went, action.
My least favorite thing at like film panels is when people say, you too can be a filmmaker, just go out with your phone, everyone has a phone. I'm like,
yeah, that was something I was going to ask you guys, because I think that first came out and people were like, posting like anyone can do anything. Look at Danny Boyle at his position. He's shooting his next movie, this huge movie on iPhone 15s. And then someone posted, I'm assuming it was photos taken from like behind a barrier in some street in London. And like it showed hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of like equipment and lenses and stuff.
Yeah.
It's actually being used.
Okay, I actually have a much better example. So I'm not going to name any names, but do you remember when the Red 1 camera was like all the rage?
Mm-hmm.
And so everyone was like, oh, if you're shooting on a Red, it's going to be really snazzy. No two people with the same camera have the same ability. Just because you're shooting with an expensive camera, you could shoot on an Alexa, but in this particular case, they were shooting on a Red 1. And quite frankly, what came out the other end was just a gray mess, because they didn't know how to frame very well and they didn't know how to grade very well. And so you're like, that's great that you've had this expensive camera, or in the case of the iPhone, an inexpensive camera, depending on like your background, like it's just not going to turn out the same way. You still have to have that like prep and the facilities to like, yeah, I mean, lighting is everything, locations are everything.
I just looked it up.
Like,
I mean, 28, the new 28, this is 28 months later. It's still like one of Danny Boyle's most expensive movies ever. I mean, it costs more than Sunshine. So, I mean, it's like,
that feels very much like oh, this is a USP that we can use.
It's also like, it's just one of those things
to like, yeah.
And it's also like, actually, because the original 28 Days Later was really doing something too, in the fact that it was using these sort of digital cameras long before kind of like digital cameras had kind of come a thing, and used it very much as an aesthetic, sort of like element of the film. And, that was kind of almost somewhat, revolutionary in its time. And that was, again, that was pretty low budget for what it was. But it's the reality is that I think people want to like create these very easy narratives with these things, but I'm sure that there's a reason why they're doing it, but it won't be a case of, oh, I just took my phone out and shot this film. It's like, I mean, I think one of the really good examples is like Sean Baker's film Tangerine. Like that's a brilliant aesthetic use of phones as a tool for shooting. But even then, they're using attachments. They're not just kind of going like, here's a phone. They're using
like,
it's like there's an artistry to what's being captured
exactly,
there.
Yeah, because I feel like, and you touched on it a second ago about, at panels and stuff, and I've heard it multiple times around different podcasts. I will hear people say, oh, everybody has access to a smartphone, so you can just go out and just make movies. And I think people now have, I guess, upgraded from, wanting to ask questions to you guys like, how do I get started? And that being, oh, we'll just use your phone, to, okay, I've been told that, but also like that doesn't really like make sense at the same time, because I think, like you said, people probably do that. They go out with just a regular iPhone and they try and shoot something, and then they look at it and it looks like crap, and they're like, okay, what? I don't understand how.
The one thing that's good about it in terms of being an equalizer, I suppose, is like when you're first starting out, it's a great way to do experiments, to figure out how to do things. But in terms of creating like necessarily like viable, whatever you want to call it, not viable art, viable product, I don't know what I'm really trying to say, sort of read between the lines on that one, but it's more to say that, you know, just because it's a way of doing things doesn't mean that it's necessarily the right medium for you, or that it's the right tool for you. I think it's a great way of exploring, but I don't necessarily think that it should be sort of touted as the solution.
And horror is a wonderfully creative genre, but it also breeds a lot of laziness because people look at things that people put a lot of work into and assume the ease of it, and that assume the most lowbrow or easygoing version of it. It's like we were at Dead Northern recently, and we watched the Blair Witch Project, which was a film I hadn't seen since I was a teenager. And I remember as a teenager kind of being like, oh, well, you know, it's just like they just went out and they just filmed some stuff with cameras. It's just like, and it's just like cheap cameras, and it's like, and it's boring because you don't really see a witch. It's just people arguing in the woods. And then I think it was really funny because I was like, well, they're playing it. We should give it another go. And it was just really fascinating because watching it this time, I was kind of like, oh, there's so much artistry going on in this that I just really didn't give it credit for. And having a better understanding now of, you know, film language and editing, and also seeing over 20 years of bad imitators and half-assed people going like, doing that exact thing. Oh yeah, you can just take some friends to the woods and nothing needs to happen, and everybody can just point a camera. Why are you filming me right now? Oh, why are you still filming? Oh, look, we found a creepy thing. Why are you filming this? You know, it's like you see a lot of that. But the Blair Witch Project, like those performers are fucking great. And it's like, and it's got this actually really quite kinetic editing pace to it. And it's really,
well, and also didn't you have your like realization?
Yes, my realization was I realized the Blair Witch Project is not about the witch. That's the I was like, oh, it's about the fear of getting lost in the woods and the breakdown in civil discourse that happens once kind of like genuine kind of like once society is lost around you. And that's what's kind of oppressive and freaky about it, is getting lost in the woods, not the supernatural witch. And it took me till this time to actually get it. But I mean, it's even like, I would say that like one of the, our executive producer on our film is Douglas Cox. And, you know, if you look at a movie like Host, I mean, again, people will come up with a million kind of like cheap, easy imitators of, oh, we're just on screens and spooky stuff's happening in the background. But one, that's tapping into an interesting element of the zeitgeist. But two, also, there's just a great amount of just stunts and production that goes into that last third of the film. So it's kind of like, it's easy to just sort of forget sometimes that like horror takes work and doing it well takes work, you know? Yeah. I've actually completely lost track of what it was that we were talking about originally.
Well, it kind of segues perfectly, because speaking of that then, because I feel like this happens where, you know, people listen to conversations like this or other podcasts or panels and things, and then they maybe get a little bit misconstrued in like how difficult some of this stuff can be. And, you know, it's, I guess, definitely in more modern times, it's become like the cool thing to make movies, and especially horror movies, because I feel like they're getting more and more mainstream and they seem like more and more cool, I guess. So for you guys personally, how does your process go from, say, like initial concept to trying to actually get something in front of the camera? Like, do you guys sit down and brainstorm ideas? Is it just things that happen? You know, you might see something on a daily basis and then come back to each other with like separate ideas and try and...
I think a lot of our work that's happened has been inspired or is like a response to something else we've seen. So, you know, our werewolf film, basically, like I like to joke about this, kind of came together out of a combination of us being at a festival watching Angst, the 40-year-old Austrian movie that Gaspar Noé has sort of like revived from the dead. And so that's like quite a crazy film. But then also combining that with, you know, us essentially just like rewatching True Blood all 6 or 7 seasons of it, and us kind of going, you know what, I don't think we're vampires, we're more like werewolves. And I was like, oh well, wouldn't it be cool to like make like a movie about more like the pack mentality of werewolves, rather than, oh well, every 31 days I get a bit sad because I have to turn into a werewolf, you know, making something quite high octane, again inspired by Angst, having that sort of more just hyperactive one crazy night energy. And like, so sometimes things come together like that, and then other times, I mean, we were just we weren't brainstorming so much as we were on the set of Kill Your Lover, and we were like, oh, what's a silly, you know, we were just joking around, and we were like, oh, what could be the sequel? Oh, well, maybe we do like what we did with relationships, but with pregnancy. We were like, kill your spawn, essentially. It's now turned into something completely different that isn't a sequel, a direct sequel, but it came from just like, I guess, just bantering and like I think most ideas are a combination of some pre-existing stuff and combining it in new ways. So we don't necessarily sit down to be like, we're going to come up with some ideas now.
When even Kill Your Lover, it essentially came out of this sort of like concept of, what if you were just trapped in a house with a zombie, and like one zombie would actually be pretty hard to kill, because it's like you see people like running around, you know, like, you know, Ash and Evil Dead just like chopping, you know, heads off with chainsaws. But actually, like if you were just a normal person and a zombie was in your house, it would be like quite daunting to try and actually kill that one zombie. And then kind of like it just kind of developed. At a certain point, we found a lot of limitations in that concept, because zombies are actually oftentimes more interesting as for what they represent allegorically than what they are like in the actual value they have as characters. So, you know, as we kind of kept developing it, we kind of like, it sort of morphed out of being a zombie and became like a person suffering from a weird disease. And I think
they could still talk.
So that they could still talk, they could still have a relationship, they could still have, you know, an emotional sort of like journey throughout it. And I think that's a lot of like the process. A lot of times you can start off with a sort of baseline idea, and then, you know, it keeps developing and sort of like getting sort of like more kind of like complex as you go on. And I do think that's the interesting thing, is I think a lot of times when you watch bad cheap horror, you're like, that never got beyond a first concept, or that never got beyond a first draft. That was just kind of like somebody stuck at this base level idea and they never sort of thought much beyond it.
And what made this then the right choice? Because I'm sure you guys probably like most spin all these different plates and have all these different projects kind of in different stages of development. What at the time, what was the decision maker in, you know, Kill Your Lover being
the first,
like the thing that you wanted to was like yeah.
Well, I think by that point, this was like, I want to say August 2021 was when we were like, we have to make a feature film. Like, but by that point you had written, I think we'd written 3 feature films. So 3 feature films were written, but they were all too expensive for us to make ourselves. So we were like, well, what could we do with the knowledge that we've accrued so far? Like if we had to do everything ourselves, what is something that we could pull off? Or we feel that we could pull off. And so, yeah, I think it was basically literally, we were at a festival at the time and we were watching some, you know, debut feature films, and we'd be the first to admit we hadn't gone to like enough film festivals really, because I think to an extent we didn't want to compare ourselves, or I think basically, long story short, is we watched these debut films and we were like, oh, okay, well, these got in. And so if we just applied our work ethic to a feature-length project, I feel like it could match up to these. Have we just been holding ourselves back, essentially? So our initial like approach was just to make a feature film that would get into this festival. And then as things went on, like, because we were making something, people got galvanized and we just were able to build a better and better team. And then a sales agent got interested before we'd even finished the film, which is definitely something we hadn't like calculated for. You know, we thought the route was you get into the film festival and then maybe you go to some other festivals and eventually a sales agent comes to you. But with us, it was the complete other way around. So it was actually very like quite disorienting. And it's not that you can expect that. It's just how I think everyone's like feature journey is different.
I think the really important thing to say about like any kind of micro budget, you know, feature is the reality is you have to build the ship while you're sailing it. Yeah. Like at a certain point, we just kind of said, we picked something that we were like, on a practical basis, we think we can make this for a pretty small, for a pretty low budget, and we can get it together. We you know, we'll put minimal cast, minimal locations, and put as much money as we can into the makeup effects, and also look at it from the standpoint of trying to go like, we want to try and invest in the characters and the performers, because that's where a lot of these things fall down, is that people don't feel comfortable trying to really get like strong performances out of like actors and really work with the actors, because they become just purely hyper fixated on the horror elements of it. So we wanted it to work on a dramatic basis, but it's like part of it was we just had to go, okay, we're going to shoot in August of next year, and we're just building to that. Everything we're doing is building towards this pin that we stuck in the calendar saying we have to film in August. And, you know, it was kind of one of those ones of we just stuck to that no matter what. So even when we didn't have enough money to do the whole film, we decided to do just flashbacks, the flashback sequences, and then try and get another try and hold off for another 3 months to get to shoot the rest of the film. And, you know, the thing is, we definitely found that once you're actually practically doing things, people start to become much more interested. There's a big difference between saying, oh, I've got a script and I'd like to make something, as to, oh, I've got the cast, I've got the location, we've got the makeup person, you know, we're going to be filming on these dates. We're going to like all of these things suddenly start to make people more interested and more intrigued by what you're doing. And that's the reality too, is the sales company, they became interested in us once we'd wrapped on the film. Like they wouldn't have been interested if we came to them with a script. They were interested in the fact that we had a final product to sell them.
And there's a lot of that going on at the moment. Like you're more likely to get someone interested if on the back end, like this, they're often like, oh, if you've got just like a product that you want to sell us and we don't have to take any of the risk, then great. You've got some content for me. Fantastic. It happens less on the front end, which is of course what we would all like to happen. But I will say as well, it's important to note, you know, that Keir and I have been working together for the last 10 years. We've been in a relationship that entire time as well. And we did a lot of the heavy lifting as far as like head of department side of things, above the line roles. Like we were the directors, producers, writers. Keir edited it. I did the post-production supervision. I delivered the film, you know, and we weren't getting paid. So that makes things a lot more possible. And I think in terms of that, we were able to be a stronghold for the rest of our team. And as we added key members to the team, that then also gave other people more confidence as well. But at one point, Keir was like, you know, if it comes to it, I'll shoot it myself as well if I have to, because I have that ability. But then we ended up, through everything that was happening, found an amazing collaborator in Oscar Garth. So then we were like, oh no, we feel confident in handing that role off to him. And if anything, that's just going to make our project stronger. But we're also aware that like not everyone has that sort of like team dynamic. And it can feel very daunting to go out by yourself.
I do think it's interesting, though. I think you're seeing a lot more directing teams. And I think partially that's one of the reasons why, because I think that especially trying to put something together on sort of like smaller or low budgets means that you're just seeing a lot more people realizing that, you know, that there's strength in being, you know, creative teams rather than just being a lone person.
I think this is a UK statistic, and I'm very open to being corrected by anyone who wants to correct me. But I saw a statistic recently where it said for every 200 directors, there's one producer. And a lot of people let themselves get held back by the fact that they can't find a producer. Well, we've still not found like our right match in a producer, you know what I mean? And like we've made so many short films, and you know, producers want to be creatively involved from like ideally an early point. And I think a lot of people treat them as like cash cows. And so I think it's really important to have like those conversations with people and find like someone you're really going to be a team with, because otherwise it doesn't make sense. I mean, you're potentially working with that person for like 2 to 4 years. So I think it's important to keep that in mind.
I think the reality is there's very few producers that honestly want to just go, yes, I will just go find you money and do all of your grunt work and have no creative involvement and just give you whatever you want. And that's like, why would you? Why would you? So, you know, ultimately, I think that's what a lot of people want. They want some mystic person who's going to come in and just be like, I've found you money, and go make whatever crazy passion that you want. And yeah.
Is there a fear then, when you've done everything yourself like this and somebody becomes interested, and because I'm sure there's probably a lot of this where, you know, you kind of get oh, we're going to do this and you guys are going to be great and we're going to do that and I'm going to sell it here and I'm going to sell it there and then everyone's going to make a bunch of money, it's going to be great, you're going to have a career. Is there a fear then of, I guess, handing that off to somebody else, and then I suppose maybe in the times of streaming and things like that, so much stuff gets bought up, and then, like you mentioned a second ago, a lot of places are just looking for that finished product, that content. Like, I'd rather purchase that than take a risk on you going to make it afterwards with my money. Is there ever a fear of maybe handing over your baby like that, and then it kind of sits on the shelf, or they just like throw it to some VOD thing and you're kind of left?
I mean, that really comes down to also making sure you're inquiring and like really digging deep on the people that are asking for your product. I mean, we were very lucky in that we have a really good relationship with the people who initially scouted our project. So we're with Dark Sky Films for North America. And so but I still did my research. I didn't just take it for granted. Like, we both interrogated it quite deeply, in that even though we felt like our gut feeling was, yes, this feels right, but let's just be careful. And so I spoke with 2 separate directors who were already with them and had been with them with their projects for a couple of years. And I was like, you know, how was it for you? How are things now? Like, how do you feel communication is? Because there are a lot of horror stories out there, absolutely, no doubt. And we definitely, like, we got approached while we were on the festival circuit by other sales agents, but also distributors. And it was interesting to see who came out of the woodwork, so to speak. And obviously we're in a position where we just had to write back and be like, hey, worldwide rights have already gone, so thank you so much, maybe on the next one, all that kind of thing. But I can definitely say that out of all of the approaches that we had, for the most part, there was maybe like 1 or 2 where I was like, oh, okay, that would have been interesting. But we ultimately felt like we ended up with the right people, which is a godsend.
Well, I think it also brings to an interesting point too about, I think, one of the biggest currencies that people don't talk about within the industry is education and information. And ultimately, it's not just a business about who you know and who knows you. It's what the people you know can tell you and the advice they can give you. And that's honestly what sets apart a lot of like industry kids and, you know, the Nepo babies and all of that, is that they're born into these sort of knowledge circles. And it's so easy to just kind of go like, I don't know, they say that they're a production company, they've released this sort of thing, you know, it's like, it's hard to know. And it's why, you know, for us, one of the biggest assets we had, you know, was the fact that, you know, we'd been friends with Douglas Cox for a long time, and he was happy to give us his advice on what he had learned over the process of, you know, working with Rob Savage and, you know, releasing Host and, you know, and Dashcam, and kind of like what their experiences would be. And so we benefited a lot off of his knowledge. And I think that that's something that you really can't undervalue within all of this, is educating and trying to make good contacts with people who can give you like the truth about a lot of this stuff.
Honestly, one of my biggest pieces of advice to maybe producing, directing teams, let's just call it that, is like, if you end up in any capacity producing your own film because you want to direct it, is to like really look into delivery, and like maybe talking to someone who has made a feature film and has delivered a feature film, because no one talks about deliverables. This is our main thing we've noticed, is like, it's not sexy, don't get me wrong. Do you know what I mean? Of course, everyone wants to talk about the starting of the thing, and then people barely even think about post-production. But then after post-production comes delivery, if you're able to sell, you know, your product. And there are a lot of things on that checklist that a lot of people don't have. So whether it's behind the scenes photos or knowing about errors and omissions insurance, that costs like a lot of money. And no one told me about that. No one told me about that before. And I think, you know, if that, yeah, again, I said that would be the first thing I'd say. And I think talking to someone directly rather than like just looking it up on the internet, that would be a good start. Don't get me wrong, that you're already ahead of like 90% of people if you know that.
Well, one of the things that,
like, just ask your peers, talk to your peers.
Well, one of the things that I would say too is that you know, I think it's very easy to go into making a micro budget feature with this sort of naive belief of going like, well, you know, I've made a short, so a short shot. I shot that over like 2 or 3 days, so this is just a short times, you know, 4 or 5, and it's not. It's a completely different kettle of fish.
And we definitely thought that's what it was going to be.
Especially on the back end. I mean, in many ways, that was kind of our naivety was almost our advantage to a certain extent.
Yeah.
But it's like on the back end, everything just becomes so much more complicated. But luckily, you know, we had people who had given us sort of make sure you have this in place. So things like errors and omissions, or, you know, kind of like even just like staying on the right side of copyright issues were just things that we were able to like head off way beforehand. We had everybody sign their contracts. We had everything organized, you know, from that standpoint. But that's what a lot of people naively forget about. And it's a really interesting thing to think about it this way. So from the conception of Kill Your Lover through to it premiering at Brooklyn Horror was roughly about 2 years.
Like, spot on,
which is a pretty quick turnaround on everything. So, and that's really short for an overall sort of turnaround on a film. But if you think about the length of 2 years, the time we actually spent on set was a total of 15 days. Like, so people think about filmmaking as like, it's people on sets yelling action, dealing with actors, doing all of that. The actual amount of time that you spend on a set in terms of making a feature film is actually a very small percentage of it. There's so much else that you have to consider outside of just standing there and saying action.
And it's really sad for you because that's your favorite bit.
That is my favorite bit.
It's his favorite bit.
Yeah, I get once the assembly cuts done, I'm bored. I'm over.
He's like, can I just like put this out here now? I'm like, no. We have so much.
If it was down to me, we would have just stuck the film on YouTube.
Is there a subgenre of horror specifically that excites both of you guys, or either of you guys, as like maybe like a world you'd like to explore? Or
this is just me. This is
Alex has a
thing.
good one for this.
One of my favorite subgenres within horror is definitely dance horror specifically. And I really want to tap into that. I don't know how I'm going to do it yet, but I feel like it's something that, you know, still has a lot of space for other editions. I mean, I'm talking like a cross between, not that this is my suggestion, but obviously some of my top titles are, I think all of this came from Black Swan, really. I'm obsessed with that movie somehow. But then also like Gaspar Noé's Climax. And then I'd say about half of the new Suspiria, the dancing bits and the new Suspiria, you know, that kind of thing. So those things really excite me. I'm personally like really into action. And by action, I guess I mean like anything that's visceral. And I feel like horror taps into action anyway. I'm not necessarily talking gunfights or martial arts, even though I do love those too. Hire me. But yeah, dance for me factors into that. And I would love to do something really cool and creative with that.
I have a weird obsession with this sort of a sort of subgenre that I feel like I've never felt anybody's really like coined a term for or anything like that, but that was very prevalent in the 90s. And I refer to it as we found a thing with a thing in it. And so it's like you know, Event Horizon, Sphere, Leviathan. I guess like the original Alien could kind of fit into this. But it's always like, oh no, there's like a deserted ship, or there's a deserted underwater thing, or there's a thing. And everybody's like, oh, everything's really peculiar around here. What's this? And there's some like, things are going awry, things are amiss. And there's an object of some sort that kind of is where everybody's like, what is this strange thing? And and then all hell breaks loose. And it's like, it's very loose. I mean, I think I would almost classify I think almost what I could say is maybe actually what it is it's facilities. Like you know, because Deep Blue Sea doesn't really fit into this, but it has a facility. Or like Underwater a couple of years ago, again, it's a facility. I like this notion of horror that takes place in facilities. So that's kind of my weird thing. I've never totally figured out a pitch on what the modern equivalent of that would be, but I like the idea of doing setting a horror in as part of the subgenre of we found a thing with a thing inside it.
How about yourself, Aaron? What do you have?
Well, I was actually just going to follow up that question with, so considering that then, if a company came to you, or if somebody came to you and said, you know, we love what you guys do, we kind of like your style and how you put everything together, but we would like a, I don't know, a found footage movie, or we would like and they gave you like a specific kind of thing, would that be something that you'd be opposed to? Would you rather just kind of do your own thing?
Not at all.
Yeah, not necessarily. I think, you know, obviously we have some pre-existing ideas that might fit into something that a company's looking for, at which point happy to adapt.
Yeah.
But then, you know, if someone came to us and said, well, we have these like things that you can work with, and if anything, like, I think limitations often make you more creative. I do think that that is true. But I think it's just finding something that actually works to that. So making something bespoke for that would also work. I think it's just making sure that it ends up being something we were actually passionate about, rather than just making a thing to make a thing, would still be important to us.
Well, I think it's also that thing of like, I think that we're very interested in a lot of kind of like more broad commercial subgenres. So it's like that thing of, you know, I would say that, you know, I'm a really big fan of the Friday the 13th series, and I love sort of like 80s slashers and, you know, giallos, and, you know, it's kind of like those kind of like people with knives thing. We have you know, we have a script that's essentially a slasher script, but it's got like the hook of it's basically like Run Lola Run if that was a slasher film. And, you know, and then even the film we're working on at the moment is it's a werewolf movie, and it's really interesting. Like, a lot of times when we're trying to explain our concepts to people, you know, it's like if you're explaining Kill Your Lover, it's like, well, it's a movie about a person who's like turning into a weird toxic creature, and it's a metaphor for their relationship. And he's growing black veins, and he burns people when he touches them, and you feel like you're having to explain a lot of the idea. But the funny thing is, like, you say to somebody, oh, we're making a werewolf movie. It's kind of like what if Crank was a werewolf movie? Then people are like, oh, I get it. So it's kind of like there's a lot of power in being able to work within the remits of what people understand culturally.
Yeah, I would just fundamentally, like, in answer to your question, say that, like, I think we primarily want to be directors. You know, we write out of necessity, we produce out of necessity. So from that perspective, we just want to collaborate with more people. We're certainly not people who are like, oh no, we only have our thing and that's it. Like, we definitely want to grow our horror family. We want to grow our film family, you know?
So I guess to follow on from that then, let's go one step, I guess, above that. If you were to be approached about the idea of making a movie in an existing franchise or an IP, is that something that you would be interested in? And if so, is there any that stick out? Like, obviously you mentioned Friday the 13th and stuff like that, but is there like any specifics there that you're like, I would love to be able to put my own spin on that?
We actually talk about this quite a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can't remember what we landed on, but I was like,
Evil Dead has always been a very obvious one that I think we find very appealing.
I quite like the idea of doing something with I Know What You Did Last Summer. I feel like there's more there, and I feel like it doesn't get spoken about as much. I know there was a TV show, right?
Yeah, there was a TV show. Yeah,
I haven't seen it, but I was just like, that happened at one
point. They're making a sort of legacy sequel at the moment.
Well, I'm not surprised.
But now, I also like there's always, I have this category of films that I created a little private list on Letterboxd for, which I call films that should be remade, because like they're like, because I always think the problem is when people remake films, most of the time they remake great films that didn't really have issues with them in the first place. So you either make something that's perfectly fine or something that's just way worse than the original. But I think that there's this, there are films that have great concepts, but the execution wasn't quite there, or the film is kind of mediocre, but you could see that there's more to come out of them. And I think that any of those, I think, are kind of like, so, I mean, I guess a great example would be like the 80s movie, The Hidden, you know, where you've got like an alien that body swaps and moves from people to people and looks like different people. And then you've got Cal MacLachlan as a sort of like alien cop who's like chasing them. Like that's a great concept. The movie is decent, but you can see how you could do so much more with it. And I think like that's the sort of stuff that I'd always be really interested in too, is being able to like take something that's a kind of known property, but be able to do something kind of interesting with it.
Is that something, because it's funny because I've had, so there's actually a guy called Stephen Follows, and he's a,
yeah.
he's
We've met him. He's great.
Yeah, and so he has the horror movie report coming out, and like I was looking at, he sent me over some of his stuff, and there's I guess a chapter or whatever you want to call it on is hiring like first time directors or a producer or a writer a financial risk for either a remake or a sequel to a big budget IP. And after, I think it was throughout 27,000 horror movies, I think it was, he compiled it all. There was I think it's 65.7% that had literally no impact on, like, they made the same amount of money, they made huge money back. But I've talked to some people, I won't name any names, but I've talked to some people who kind of felt like they were getting their big break or whatever you want to call it after having maybe their own movie. They got contacted to make a sequel-ish to a really big IP, and then it just ended up not being the experience I think they were expecting to have. And I don't want to say it it broke the career, but unfortunately from an audience standpoint, he sort of felt like they all turned on him and were like, oh, you ruined that thing I loved, you made it even worse. It's like the worst thing ever.
I think it's difficult because I think, yes, a lot of people treat the directors as the face of these things sometimes, but they're not aware of what's going on behind the scenes. So there's definitely a risk to jumping from, say, something that was made for under $1 million to something that was made for 8 million or more, especially if it's a franchise thing and people sticking a bunch of money into it. I think sometimes that jump can be very scary and hard to like know yourself enough, especially if you're going from working with a team that you know to now you're surrounded by execs telling you what to do and you don't know how to handle the politics necessarily. Like getting a steady, like going from indie straight into that can be very daunting. Again, that's where I think a really important, like a strong support system of people who know their shit is like really important, because I feel like otherwise it would be very, very, very scary and like very dangerous as well, potentially. Though I will say that obviously these guys have made loads of movies before they made the Scream movies, but Radio Silence obviously had that experience with Scream, where like, you know, they did get a lot of hate, but they were just like, whatever.
Yeah.
They didn't let it like affect them too much. You know, I'm sure they had their bad days, but you know, they found a way of dealing with it. And I think they'd had enough experience by that point.
I think it's an interesting one too, because it's that kind of case too of like with Radio Silence as well. It's a case where those films made money regardless, you know, and I think the fifth one was pretty well received. I think it was the sixth one that had a lot more pushback on it. And I think they made money. I think that the big problem comes when not only do the fans, you know, sort of turn on you, but when it bombs, that's difficult. We definitely know someone, I'm not going to name names, but like who would definitely say that they really regret taking on an IP film because they said the script sucked and they thought that they could power through it, and they realized that the script, that it just wasn't, and they kind of feel like it just really kind of like just really set them back massively. So it can really depend an awful lot. And I think it's really interesting because I'm sort of obsessed with the documentary De Palma, where like Brian De Palma just like sits down and just goes through his entire career. And the thing that always got me is it's like he sort of says people act like directors have this whole kind of like strategy or think this. I'm like, well, for my second movie, I'm going to do this, and then for my third, but I'm going to hold back this for my third movie. And it's like, he's actually like, you know, you make movies a lot out of kind of like circumstance and what the time is and what you're into and what your situation is and what you need in terms of money, where you're staying, who you're with, all of these things. It's like, they're all very circumstantial how you end up making stuff. And I think that can be really difficult for people to understand sometimes. I think people want there to be some kind of grand logic, and you made this IP thing because you were trying to, this is your passion, or this is your thing. And then, you know, or it might have just been, I made it because I wanted to try and level up in my career. I wanted to get somewhere else, and I wanted the best for it, but I was in a circumstance that I couldn't, you know, sort of like get beyond. And it's just, you know, films are made with lots of people. It's like, it's hard to just have, as a director, have full control over everything, especially as it gets bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like that's probably the simplest way I've heard that explained, because I always feel, for obviously from doing this for so long and talking to so many different people, and then having, I guess, off-air conversations, and hearing that real like raw version of like, this dude, this isn't what I intended on happening, and it just, the whole thing fell apart, and I just had no control, and I was just kind of like brought in and kind of told what to do, and didn't really realize that that's what I was signing up for. And it's just, it's so unfortunate, like, because I feel like some people, it can kind of be a make or break, and they tend to kind of allow themselves to feel like, oh well, the fans turned on me, you know, now the studio wants nothing to do with me because it bombed, so it's like, guess I'll just go back to doing nothing again.
Well,
Yeah,
I think the struggle is too, sometimes when something doesn't do well, you then move into trying to go like, oh, well, I need to get the audience back, or I need to rebuild something, or I need to do something that they're gonna, and that doesn't always work either. If you're working scared, if you're working, you know, to try and kind of like win back an audience, then, you know, potentially, you know, that's not going to help you either. And there's all sorts of difficult circumstantial things that happen. I mean, it's one of the crazy things is, you know, there's that movie Magazine Dreams, which stars Jonathan Majors, and that movie had like great buzz out of Sundance. Then the Jonathan Majors scandal happened, and now who knows if that film will ever be released. And like, the shame is like, so many people worked on that movie, and, you know, obviously I'm not condoning anything Jonathan Majors did, you know, but it's just like that thing of like, it's so sad that one person can fuck up and all of this work other people did. And, you know, and that's part of the industry. Ultimately, part of the industry is that you have much less control over how all of this will function than you actually, you know, and all you can do is try your best and work to the circumstances and what's going on at the time.
From a fan and a consumer point of view, then, do you guys have comfort movies that you find yourself revisiting a lot, or do you try and like always look for, you know, something new or different things that you haven't seen before?
I think we've definitely been in a phase of rewatching movies, and we've been mostly watching movies, and we've moved away from TV a little bit because it's become a bit overwhelming, like how much stuff there is. And I was like, well, there's some great stuff out there. It's just sometimes it's difficult to like buy into new things. And I think that's why we're seeing so much like fandom develop around stuff that's like maybe a bit older, and we're like remembering, and there's like a bit of a nostalgia wave, I'd almost say. So it's definitely comforting to go back to stuff that we like. I mean, I'd still say it's probably a good diet of new and old. Well, I mean, but like comfort movies for me anyway involve my other favorite subgenre, which is not horror necessarily, but they all seem to involve games or board games of some sort. So you're talking like Ready or Not, or Game Night for me in particular, which is obviously more like thriller comedy. But that's like my sweet spot for like something. I think comfort movies in particular like will often be something you've seen before and you know exactly what you're getting. But then on the other hand, in terms of like, we'll watch plenty of new releases, and then a lot of the stuff you show me is new for me, but
we go to a lot of we go to a lot of repertory screenings, because you know, from say the Prince Charles to like the Garden Cinema, there's a lot of like options in London to go see kind of things, and there's
on
just
the big screen, and it's such a joy to get to see it on a big screen.
And there's a lot of movies that just, you know, you get ultimately like so much more value out of it. And I mean, even like we had a magical Christmas a number of years ago where Alex saw Gremlins for the first time, And
I'm like the oldest, as in like age-wise, oldest new Gremlins fan like ever, I feel, because I watched that film for the first time in 2021. So,
but it's like it's that thing of I think it's always kind of a combination of both, because I think it's like you try to make your diet as diverse as possible. So it's like, you know, as much as, you know, we do, I had a weird kind of nostalgic thing a couple of days ago where I watched Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels and Snatch back to back, you know, as a kind of like nostalgia thing. But tonight we're gonna watch Strange Darlings and It's What's Inside, you know, back to back, is, you know, kind of like getting a diet of some new stuff. So it's like, you know, I think we try to keep a mixture of both. And I mean, you know, we're both obsessed with the substance and trying to like basically. Yeah. Alix it was really funny because you know, you basically just like anybody you talk to, you'll just be like you know, you'll just evangelize for the substance.
I mean, basically, like my whole thing is like, you don't have to love it. I don't care if you like it or not. I think everyone should see it at least once so that we can have a chat about it. But it might end up becoming a comfort movie. I don't know. We'll see.
I mean, I will say one of my ultimate comfort movies is definitely Crimson Tide. It's just, you know, I just.
Nice.
Because you're an old man.
I got during COVID, I was sick for like a week, and all I did was I was like I'm just gonna dedicate myself to watching nothing but submarine movies for a week, and just, you know, and just kind of like just go through just what are all the submarine movies.
Do you find, kind of speaking nostalgia and things like that, I'm always kind of fascinated to get other people's opinions on this. Do you find that because I found like I went through a period there of, I found it really hard to have that healthy diet of like, I knew there was new things coming out, but I didn't know whether, and it sounds so dumb in a way, because it doesn't really require that much investment other than just time, like 90 minutes, whatever. But I kind of found myself being like, oh, I don't know if I want to commit to that. I'll just go back to like what I know I enjoy. And like I was like rewatching things from the early 90s and 80s over and over and over again. And I feel like a lot of people do that. Do you think that's down to, I guess, the time we live in? Like I remember I would rent tapes from, you know, a local video store or a Blockbuster or whatever, and it felt like way more of a commitment because you've rented this thing for the weekend, and regardless of whether it was going to be garbage or not, I was like, I'm committed to watching this probably at least twice.
Yeah.
That's how I managed to watch Ghosts of Mars so many times. I was like, I rented this, I got it for 3 days, and it's like the one video I rented.
Yeah.
So what else am I gonna do? I guess I should rewatch Ghosts of Mars multiple times.
I think it's definitely a mixture of like a lack of scarcity. Like obviously there's a lot out there, but you don't know if you can trust trailers, you don't know if you can trust reviews. Like it's all a bit like I don't know for sure unless like some of my friends have watched it and I trust their opinions or something, but even then it can be a risk. And then I also think on top of everything, I wouldn't know, like it's going to be hard to know this for like another 10 years, but it's either an age-based thing maybe, where it's like we have more responsibilities and it's hard to like even decide what you're going to have for dinner, let alone what movie you're going to watch, right? So it could be that, but then maybe it's also because of like all this shit we've just been through with like COVID and other things and the strikes and this and that. And you're like, again, maybe you don't want to challenge yourself too much. Maybe it's a combination of the two. Maybe it's just the first one. I'm not sure. But I think there is definitely like probably some comfort seeking that's been going on.
I think for me personally, and I can only speak about it from a personal standpoint, is it's that weird thing of, I think that when I find myself in a place where I'm kind of like, oh, I'm going to watch a movie, it becomes easy to go, I'm going to watch that thing that I know I'm going to have a healthy, happy, you know, sort of experience with, as opposed to this risk that I'm taking on. Because, you know, the reality is like, you know, we've had plenty of occasions where we've kind of gone, oh, we should check out this new thing. And then we sit there and we just kind of go like, this just isn't very good. I'm not enjoying it. And I just kind of like, and there's that point where you kind of go, your brain does kind of go, well, I could have, yeah. Did you ever watch, did you watch Peep Show?
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah.
There's like this episode of Peep Show that we quote a lot, which is where Mark and Jeremy, they're at a play, and they go like, and one of them looks at the other and goes, "I can't believe this costs more than a film. For less than this, I have Heat on DVD. For less than this, we could be watching Robert De Niro and Al Pacino." And I just do think about that, the amount of times where you're just watching something and you go, I could be watching Heat instead of this.
And it's funny because I've talked to so many people, and I've definitely done this as well, where they say like, you know, you've got all these streaming platforms, Paramount Plus, and all these different things. And I feel like sometimes the more of them I have, I'm like, I feel like I need to have them all because I'm like, I want to watch all this stuff. And then there's times I get like paralyzed where I spend nearly the runtime of a movie, like looking at thumbnails or like looking at trailers. And then I actually don't watch anything. I just turn everything off and I'm like, okay, I'm just going to like forget about that now.
Now I'm just going to go doom scroll on my phone.
My bad version, and maybe this is an elder millennial version of doom scrolling, is I just end up basically watching 5 or 6 episodes of a TV show that I've watched 100 times before. So it's like, recently it's been South Park. So I've just been rewatching episodes of South Park in my spare time. And it's that one thing of, I'm like, this feels like it's because I know all these episodes, there's no surprises. I don't really need to like pay attention to anything. And I know that it'll give me some baseline enjoyment. It's almost like I don't need to take any risk. I can just kind of like have it on in the background. But it's also, to a certain extent, I wonder what is the value of me watching, you know, this episode for the umpteenth time. You know, it's like, what do I get out of that? And I think that's it's an interesting one, you know, kind of like, you know, how do we invest in watching new things sometimes?
I think that's why I like watching new movies in cinemas in particular, if I can, especially indies. I try and support indies as best I can, but a lot of them don't get to go to theaters anymore. And I think, especially for indies that maybe don't have as much cash as studios, like it's harder to grab attention in the same way. So if you're putting everyone on a level playing field on streaming, of course, you're going to get people who maybe are upset that it's not, I don't know, The Fall Guy, you know, whereas like you'd be able to engage with something more full on if you have no other distractions. And a lot of people, in terms of like, even production companies, they're saying, you know, we need to make sure something's happening every 7 minutes so that we can compete with the second screen that we all know is in the room.
Well, I think that's the interesting thing is it's the casualness with which we engage with streaming. Whereas like, you know, again, if you, as you said, you know, if you rented a video, you drove to the store, you rented the video, you brought it back, you had to sit down, put it into the VCR and commit to watching that. But it's like, again, it's like, you just kind of like, you're on Netflix, there's a million things. You just go, I'll check this out. You know, 10 minutes go by. You're like, I'm not feeling this. You just move to the next thing. It's like, it's almost more like how like network television used to work. You know, it's just like, you could just channel surf, you know, it's like kind of streaming surf now.
So speaking of that, then I've 1 or 2 more questions before I let you guys go, but kind of following on from that, from a professional standpoint, then, in your opinion, what's the hook? So let's say you make a movie and it comes to, let's say Netflix takes it and they want to make it like this big release or whatever, but within the confines of Netflix. Like, what would you say the hook needs to be? Does it need to be like is it like years ago? Do we need to have like good cover art? Does it need to be word of mouth? Does it need to be some sort of viral marketing campaign? Like, how do you capture? Because I feel like even things like TikTok and stuff, I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that would say, well, it's, you know, it's changed my life. It's done this, it's done that. It's exposed me maybe to new things that I never knew about. But then there's a lot of like you said a minute ago about doom scrolling where people literally, this is all it takes to just like next. What would you say like the big hook would be?
I mean, with Netflix, at least, like they would be doing they would decide on the marketing strategy on their end anyway, and they obviously have, at that point they will have invested a lot of money, so they're like, okay, we're going to figure out whatever needs to be done in order to push this out in the best way we know possible. So we wouldn't have any say in that. I think ultimately, I guess, you know, again, we would have to think about concept and what like if we were looking, I guess is the question, like if we were looking to appeal to Netflix and get signed on as a Netflix original.
Yeah, maybe not. Yeah, maybe not. Netflix is probably a bad example, but I guess the thing of your movie going to stream and then potentially having to battle it out with all these other things, because I feel like a lot of people out there make a lot of good a lot of good movies that just kind of unfortunately disappear. And it's like, what would you say the hook is outside of obviously making something that you would consider viable? But like, how can you kind of control?
It's really difficult because the thing is, I think ultimately, I think Keir will agree with this, but I'm just going to speak for myself, is like, if you try and outthink everything, you're probably going to end up with something kind of mediocre that doesn't really do anything. So we definitely subscribe to the more idiosyncratic it is, the more likely it is to appeal to people, maybe. But I think
you'll find an audience, I think, is more the idea of that. Yeah. It's like if you make something, if you make
a copy, a like low budget copy of a studio movie, you're less likely to get anywhere, I guess. But I wanted to make the comparison to the Terrifier series, for instance, because I was just at Siewert and they were just talking about the whole way that worked out in terms of just like, they've never really had to spend much on marketing because they've had so much like user generated content that's allowed them to just like just do what they've done, you know, and it's just sort of progressed from there, and they couldn't have planned for that. So it's really difficult as creators to try and like capitalize, I guess. And I guess it's more if you've got to a point where the film is getting lost, maybe that's when you need to like do more, but I don't know. It's just a whole other ball game.
I mean, I think there's a couple of interesting avenues in this. I think one, there's this kind of notion of, you know, these USPs or these kind of experiences. You know, I think, you know, if you had said Terrifier or Skinamarink would have been these sort of big sort of like successes, I don't think necessarily people would have expected that. And I think in both cases, they're films that represent something of an experience on an indie level. You know, it's kind of like, and I think that's what so much of cinema has come down to now in terms of big money-making cinema is pure spectacle. So both Terrifier and Skinamarink kind of represent their own kind of weird little spectacles of like the experience that you go to for it, which is why I think horror benefits in a lot of ways in a way that like indie dramas or indie comedies don't, because horror can maintain that sort of point of being an experience. But I think the other thing that's kind of interesting within this, and I think that this is something that you look at, say, Benson Moorhead, or more recently, say, Damien McCarthy, I think you're looking at how people start building their brands. And I think that that's especially on an indie level, if rather than kind of going
iconography, I guess.
Yeah. Well, it's also like if you go less from the idea of I'm trying to make a copy of what a studio would make, you go, I have these personal visions and ideas that are kind of being put together on these low budget things. Like fans start to actually accumulate around the sort of the consistency and the universe and the ideas of these things. And so I think that there's almost a mentality now that you should start, if you're an indie filmmaker, you should start thinking about, you know, how your 3 movies will fit together versus just making one movie that's going to make you.
But of course, not forgetting about your audience.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of talk about, you know, horror is like kind of one of the last bastions of these are potentially films that a group of friends might decide to go watch together and have a good time at, right? So I think if you're thinking about your audience and your audience having a good time as well, like rather than just being like, oh, I've just got my like flights of fancy and like hopefully they'll appeal to someone. Of course that would be great, and sometimes that works out and that's amazing. But I mean, I'd be the first to admit that I am thinking about like how would this like appear to, or how is this going to be in terms of a roller coaster ride, if you will, for a group of friends that's going to get them chatting and get them excited.
I have 2 more questions before I let you guys go. And I guess one is kind of, I don't know how much we can get into or whatever, but Gray Sky, and I listened to you guys on another show. We'll talk about the idea of the gray man and all that stuff, and it was something I feel like I had heard of, but not like I didn't really know much about it. what can you talk about as regards that, or that concept or idea?
I guess the interesting thing with that one, it's really interesting you picked up on that, is I got a message from a Scottish friend who said, "Oh, you have a concept for the grey man? Well, so do I." And I was like, our concepts could be like, couldn't be more different, you know? And so it's quite interesting. I think what I can speak to is that we're more doing a spin on the myth and like making it like work towards also other ideas that we find interesting. So I think a lot of our films have ended up being a spin on monster movies. Like we often end up making monster movies, but it's like a spin on the monster, not the literal monster, because we essentially did a bit of research actually on like Bigfoot movies, because there aren't that many Bigfoot movies, and we were like, maybe it's in this space, but a lot of the time,
I mean, there's a lot of Bigfoot movies. There's no good Bigfoot movies.
This is true.
Yeah.
And we're not talking like this is it. Like watching them, like a lot of them end up being, you know, it's just a kind of a person in a goofy suit kind of thing. And we were like, well, how do we take that more into the folk horror space, and how do we make it sort of mysterious rather than overt and literal? And we're kind of taking it, what I can say for Grey Sky is that we're taking it in more of an eco folk horror space of like the relationship of the myth to the land and these ancient beings and Celtic mythology. Like that's kind of where we're going with it.
Trying to give it a little bit of like a Lovecraftian kind of like flavor to it as well.
Very different from like a lot of the other concepts we've been working on, but kind of a bit witchy, which I always love.
I mean, I do think there's something really interesting in this notion of, especially with monster movies, is that people take a lot of like the rules and ideas of the monsters very much at face value, and they don't think much beyond it. And I think one of the things that's very interesting about, say, like a case like Bigfoot movies, because that's the closest thing that we can look at, you know, when thinking about something like the Gray Man, is it's Bigfoot doesn't have any character. Bigfoot is not interesting. Bigfoot is just a monster in the woods. He could be a werewolf. He could be anything, because people don't do anything with him. It's just people go out in the woods. Oh, there's something stalking you. And then eventually the monster attacks you and it's Bigfoot. And you're just kind of like, cool. It doesn't matter that it's Bigfoot. Like you haven't done anything with this mythos. You haven't done anything to make this particularly interesting. It's just a generic monster in the woods. And I think that's kind of where a lot of these things become quite interesting, is how can you delve that level deeper? And even if you think about werewolves, like if you look at the lists of the greatest werewolf movies of all time, it's always 5 that basically appear at the top. Like there'll be an interchangeable amount at the underneath it, but you know, the top 5 will always be The Howling, American Werewolf in London, The Original Wolfman, Ginger Snaps, and Dog Soldiers. Those 5 are at the top of every single list. And it kind of makes you realize, actually, there's not a lot of great werewolf movies in this way, where you kind of, you think of it as such a strong subgenre, you know, but like compared to vampires, who are characters that tend to have a lot more agency, they have a lot more personality, they have a lot more that people can do with the mythos. Werewolves are kind of limiting, because most of the time they're just people who turn into a monster, and then once they're a monster, they're not very interesting. And I think that's where a lot of the tricks of this stuff comes in, and that's certainly something that we're looking with the Gray Man, of how can you make that more interesting than not just be some sort of like spooky figure in the woods.
Yeah, that you're definitely onto something with that, because as you were saying that, I was trying to apply that to other, I guess, don't want to say subgenres, but other types of movies. And I think the assumption is always, well, there's lots of them, so that's it then. But it's like you said, it's like, well, there may be lots of something, but there's like very, very, very minute amount that are actually like worthwhile. And I think that probably ties into that thing you said earlier about, you know, people jump on it and it's like, okay, everybody needs to make a Bigfoot movie. Everybody needs to make a found footage movie. Everybody wants to make a body horror movie. And it's like majority of them are like so subpar. It's just like,
I think the other thing is, again, if you're making a copy of something you've seen before, so to speak, it's like you want to kind of lean away from that, because if you make your own rules, then you have more freedom in a way. And like some people are still not going to like it. You know what I mean? Like we've got a werewolf movie. I'm sure there's going to be people who are like, that's not the way it's supposed to be. But there are definitely a lot of ways in which we're making our own rules, and we're kind of establishing a new status quo, I guess. It's a riff. It's not it's not American Werewolf in London. It's not Dog Soldiers. It's, you know, it's playing its own tune, and like you're either into the tune or you're not. Whereas I think if we were making werewolf movie, the werewolf movie, people are more likely to compare it to other things.
When it's like that thing of my favorite zombie movie of all time is Return of the Living Dead, and part of what I like about Return of the Living Dead is like the zombies scheme. They've got plans. And also it creates its own weird mythos. This whole notion that zombies eat brains came from that. You know, it's like,
yeah, which is insane, because I had no idea that was a thing. Like we were doing this. Like I grew up in Switzerland partially, and we were running around the playground going brains with the arms out and all that stuff. And I'm like, knowing now that that's where that comes from is like mind boggling to me. I'm like, how did that make its way through the culture?
And it's just, so it's that funny thing of kind of like, I think people really forget that at some point somebody had to invent these rules, and like these things aren't necessarily these things that we just think are perfectly sort of pushed into the culture, and they're just kind of, that's the way they are, you know. They don't need to be. You can kind of come up with your own spins.
And the evolution is the fun part.
Yeah,
like we're all working on it together in a way.
Yeah, there's definitely, I don't know, I was just kind of, as you said that there, I was like, oh, that's an interesting way to look at it. And even the idea of having a riff on an existing idea, I think people are kind of and not brainwashed, but you kind of assume like, if okay, I have an idea for a werewolf movie, but I can't do that because this is what a werewolf movie is, and this is like the world it lives in, so I obviously can't do that, which I think, like you said, can be quite limiting. It gives you kind of a set area to play in, and you can't expand past that. Two final things for you guys. Where's the best place that people can keep up to date with you? Is it the website? Is it on socials? Like, where are you guys most active and up to date?
That's a good question. Thank you for asking. I think Instagram is probably our main home. So production company wise, if you look for Switchblade Cinema, our names are a little bit impossible to spell, especially this one. So if you look for Switchblade Cinema, you'll find our profiles through that, because it'll say founded by or whatever. And then we're both quite active on our personal profiles. And then for Kill Your Lover, there's its own page as well, which you can also find there. So Switchblade is kind of like the nexus, if you will, like the little center point. And then if you want to check out any of our short films, we are quite like free and open with like what we've done in the last 5 years. So you can find all of those on our website. A lot of them are on Alter as well. The YouTube channel Alter. So if you type it into YouTube as well, you'll find it. Both Wretch and Sucker and Do Not Resuscitate are on there. But it'll be easier again if you just go to switchblade-cinema.com. You'll just find.
So that's Wretch, RETCH, and Sucker, spelled exactly as it sounds. Sucker, you know?
But again, you'll find those on the website. So then you don't even have to think about spelling. All you got to spell is Switchblade Cinema.
For everybody listening or watching, all the links will be down below in the description on whatever platform you're listening to this on. So it'll be super easy for you to find it. I just wanted you guys to kind of say it in your own words, I guess.
Yeah. No, thank you so much. And thank you so much for great questions as well. It's honestly been a joy.
It's been a pleasure. And like, I always do that. I have to, like, with certain people, I get into the conversation like, okay, I have to be conscious of other people's time. So just stop talking and get to the end. And then maybe in a couple of months, you can do it again.
Sure.
Final question that I have for you guys is, why horror, and what does it mean to both of you guys?
Why horror? I think this is the thing, is I literally didn't know I liked horror until I was 20. I had always been ingesting morbid, creepy stuff via like anime and manga. But the idea of like mainstream horror was like, oh, clearly I don't like horror. And what I love so much about horror and discovering horror, both past and present now, is like, it's just one beautiful spectrum. Like I was recently describing it as one beautiful rainbow made of variations of grays and blacks, you know, like there's something for everyone. And I love introducing people to the genre as well, because it's so varied. And I think there's a lot of human experience, human horror that gets quite close to the bone, but can give you this cathartic experience that I just love. yeah, there's no other way to put it. I just love it.
Well, I have a theory that I think that a lot of the best horror is somewhat operatic in nature, and that I think that horror is similar to musicals in the sense that when they talk about musicals, they talk about how, you know, when the emotions become so grand that you can't say it, you sing it. And I think of horror a little bit like that. Like the best kind of horror deals with these grand emotional ideas and these inner turmoils that ultimately are expressed best through these sort of grand metaphorical ideas and these sort of big things. And I think that's something we're very attracted to, is kind of like, you know, in a similar way to say something like the Twilight Zone, or, you know, like, you know, it's about this idea of expressing grander ideas through this kind of allegorical, you know, sort of spectrum. And I just, yeah, I think it's a brilliant way to discuss and look in themes. And also it's just fun. You know, it's like, you know, when you were a kid and you were looking for, you were so fascinated by, you know, sort of like gore and, you know, violence and this ideas. Like I remember being a kid and looking at VHS box covers and them just being like, just promising all of this kind of like depravity. And the thing is, like, when you actually watch them, a lot of the time they weren't actually anything that, but there's something that's just beautiful and pure about this notion of just these very pure human emotions and experience that can come out of it.
Guys, it's been a pleasure. I appreciate you taking the time. It's been fun. I wish you all the best with everything for the last bit of this year, and I would love to do this again at some point in 2025.
Yeah, we would love that too.
Love it.
Thank you so much.
Best of luck with everything. Best of luck with the movie, and I actually can't wait to see what you guys have coming next.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.